Today, we're talking about how to be yourself at a time when borders are closed. This is going to be particularly relevant for if you have family or yourself is spread across borders, right? If you've got family that are in other countries and you're managing yourself at a time when these borders are closed. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And for that reason, it's also really relevant to recognize the land on which we stand. So I'm not far from the University of Victoria. I'm at home. And the territory that we are on right now is the Lekwungen people's traditional territory. And as well as that, the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich people have a historical relationship that they continue to today. So that's kind of recognizing, grounding us where we are now. I'm going to share my slides. Let's see, for a little bit. There we go. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
And then in addition to me, I'm really thrilled to have Farzana and Wyle to get here as panelists. So Farzana and Wyle, I mean, not only are they two of my favorite people in the world, but they're also both brilliant and some of the most empathetic people that you'll ever meet. They have personal experiences they're going to be sharing today, and as well professionally, they work in this space. So they both consult to organizations, helping them improve diversity, inclusion, and equity in their organizations. They'll introduce themselves in a little more broadly in a few minutes, but as well as you'll see, Farzana has just published a book called Raising Multicultural Children, Tools for Nurturing Identity in a Racialized World that has just come out. So congratulations, Farzana.
Thank you.
And Wyle is the CEO and founder of a firm called HRX, which does some analytics and other consulting around diversity and inclusion and equity. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
The purpose of today is these three things. So the chat should be open, and if you're willing to, I would love to hear you share, for any of you on the webinar today, where you're located and where your family are spread around the world. Do know that this webinar is recorded, so anything you share in the chat will be recorded along with the webinar. So just share anything that you're comfortable sharing at that point. As well, the chat will be open throughout, so feel free to share any similar experiences or different experiences to those that Wyle and Farzana are sharing. I'm here as a researcher, so I do research around these topics. I'm going to be sharing some of the research-supported strategies for navigating a global identity when borders are closed. So at this point, I want to open it up, and I'm going to start with Wyle and then go to Farzana. Could you please each introduce yourselves, your global families, and then also talk about that first question. What is the biggest challenges that you've experienced as a result of the closed borders?
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Stacey, for having me here. My name is Wyle Baoween. I'm actually an alumni of Gustavson. And being in Gustavson was the reason I came from where I am originally from. I am originally from Yemen, Middle East. I was born, though, in Saudi Arabia. I lived most of my life there. And then in 2011, I came to Canada here. And now I am a proud Canadian, just as of last year. I run HRX. HRX is a consulting firm that does a lot of work around equity, diversity, and inclusion, training, consulting, and analytics. So this work really relates to, like I always tell people, HRX is my personal story and my business aspiration. Like it managed to have both of them in it. And I think when I came to Canada, I just realized how beautiful this diversity thing and having people together and being inclusive to everyone. I had really beautiful stories of people around me just included me and helped me and supported me, and also tough times where I struggled coming from a different culture. So I was reflecting on the challenges of COVID-19 and the border closure and all of that. And I was thinking, being from Yemen, I don't know, for you who know Yemen, Yemen is a very poor country. Having my Yemeni passport all my life, borders were effectively closed to me. Traveling was very hard for us, very hard for us. I always tell my wife, who's from Vancouver, you are so lucky to be from here, because you can wake up in the morning and say, hey, you know what, I'm gonna go next month to London to visit friends. If you are from Yemen with a Yemeni passport, that's a year planning. You know, it's so hard. You have to print your bank account, you have to prove a lot of things, you have to apply and apply again and go for interviews. So until last year, and I remember the first time I went to London, that was my first trip with my Canadian passport. I went to the person on the border, and she's like stamped the passport and let me in, and I'm like, oh, that's it. She's like, yeah, that's it. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. So borders were closed for me. They just opened like slowly in the last few years, being from here. My family left Yemen in 2015 because of the war. They are refugees now in Jordan. And we have been trying to bring my mom and my sister for 5 years now to Canada. And on March 11th, they got their approval to come here as refugees. March 11th, huh? And the people who informed us about that, they said, you know what? They got the visas. I don't know how long this COVID-19 will delay the process. And you know what? We were very excited, but then we realized it could take very long time for them before coming here. And I will talk maybe more later about the challenges they face there. They are in a country where there is total curfew, you call it? Can't go out?
Lockdown?
Yeah? Lockdown. So people can't go out. There's my sister and my mom. There is no other person helping them there. My sister tells me stories about going out to buy bread when they open like a small window of time for people to go shopping. And she says, I go to this bakery and people are just like packed. People are fighting each other to get their basic needs, you know? And she's standing there, and then when it's done, she goes to the bakery, and the guy, she asks him, can I have some bread? And he's like, you know what, sister, there's nothing left. So it has really impacted me in a just like incredibly, in an incredible way, you know, just like so much impact. So these are some of the challenges I'm facing now, trying to figure out living in this new world, you know, and communicating and helping and supporting and figuring out how we can help each other and manage our life, you know, in this new normal.
Thanks so much, Wyle. That's, I mean, I invited you to come in part because of this story, and it's kind of the extreme of what closed borders really mean. Absolutely. To a family. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Farzana?
Yes, I would like to first say, wow, thanks for sharing that. It really resonates and relates to my family in a way historically, because I actually grew up in Canada, and my mother is from the Philippines. My father's from Pakistan. And they were the first to come to Canada and to anywhere other than their countries, in both of their families. So they've gone through this process of immigration and you know, assimilation really into Canadian culture and making a life for them and myself and my sister. And I moved to the United States, where I live now. I live in Los Angeles in 2004 for grad school, and ended up staying here. I do work as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. And I am an author, as was mentioned, and I do coaching. And what I'm seeing is that because of COVID-19, that those issues of, again, trying to fit in and have a sense of belonging have come up again. And in the work that I've seen, the organizations that I've worked with, there is an uptick in anti-Asian racism. And we have seen this historically when there have been wars or internment in North America overall. And because of this virus being blamed on, in particular, China, and as a result, any East Asian person that resembles someone from China, there have been racist attacks. There have been, you know, vandalism against Asian small businesses. There has been barring from entry, people being spat on, hit, punched, tripped. Just a few days ago, there was someone who had acid thrown on them. because they were Asian and were blamed for the virus. And the perpetrators say it. It's not something that we need to uncover as, is this related? They actually say it as they're doing the act, so we know. So this is unfortunately permeating through both of our countries in Canada and in the United States and around the world. From what I hear, it's happening in Europe and even parts of Asia against East Asians as well. So my concern is for people having that sense of being othered, and also what we can do in terms of our roles in leadership. And I work with employee resource groups, ERGs, and there has been a movement around having those groups activating around facing racism and offering support and being a collective. So I'm seeing some promise there. And at the same time, I do look back at history and think about, you know, the idea of the perpetual foreigner and how that's coming up again. So it's quite personal to me, just in me not being able to see my family, get on a plane right now. I feel very disconnected from them. And also with what's going on in the world, just with the different communities being targeted.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Farzana. For anyone who doesn't know, an employee resource group, Farzana, do you want to explain what that is and what you do with them?
Yes, an employee resource group is in an organization. It's an affinity group based on a certain demographic. So it could be race or gender identity, or your generation even, or your parenting role. And they really function to support individuals within a company or any organization. And they really are effective in creating community for people and bringing to light issues and togetherness around a variety of different topics.
Good. Okay, thanks for that. If any of you on the webinar are some of our students, if you've joined any ethnic student club or group, that would be the equivalent in an organization. Very similar to that. Good. Thank you. So thanks so much, Farzana. That's, I mean, your story, your family, and particularly the work that you do, anti-racism work, is really important. I'm going to be talking a little bit later about how we can try to mitigate some of the racism and especially anti-Asian bias that's happening right now. But I want to pick up on something that both of you talked about. You both talked about how these closed borders in some ways kind of reflect who we are, and that it changes the way that we think about ourselves.
Yeah.
So let's see here. I'm going to share a little bit of research around this. Both Wyle and Farzana, as you heard, have multiple cultures, right? When I'm talking about cultures, I'm not talking about ethnicity or race. I'm talking about how you identify yourself, right? Which countries or societal cultures are really core, central to who you are and how you think about yourself. And so you can think about this as ranging along a spectrum. From monocultural, so this is someone who has just one culture. So I'm actually monocultural because my family immigrated to Canada about 3 generations back, and I no longer identify with any of my ancestral or heritage cultures. And it ranges to people who are highly multicultural, as both Farzana and Wyle are and describe themselves as. And this matters because it changes how you identify yourself can influence how you interact with the world. And at a time like this, when borders are closed, what happens is it can often feel like the boundaries between our cultures are thickened, right? They can feel less porous. It can feel much more difficult to go between our cultures and think about ourselves as both and, rather than thinking about, you know, this versus that. And there's a few different ways that people respond to this type of situation. Right. One way that people respond is that some people end up prioritizing one of their cultures over the others. So that would be similar to, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, the big circle and the little circle, where you end up, this would be particularly relevant if any of you had to choose which country you were going to isolate in during the crisis. Right, some of you had to choose, am I going to stay in the country where I work? Am I going to go to the country where my parents live, or maybe where I immigrated from? And this choice can change the way that you think about yourself.
Absolutely.
So that would be one option, one way that people end up kind of making sense of these closed borders. Another option is that sometimes people end up becoming even more committed to their national or cultural identities. And I'll give you an example of how this can happen. Right after the 9/11 terrorist attack, there was a research study that happened in the United States. And what they did is they said, well, what does this do to our identities when we are reminded of our own mortality? And as well at a time when, after that attack, borders felt far more important than they ever felt before. And what they found is that at a crisis like that, when borders were tightened, then everyone felt more attached to their own country or societal cultures, right? So you can see all the lines go up after they were reminded of the 9/11 attack. But this was the difference was particularly striking for people who were exploring their identities. The kinds of people who are exploring their identities, maybe less certain about their identities, tends to be adolescents, right? As we all know, adolescents do a lot of identity exploration. Also, young people in their 20s or young adults still tend to do a lot of identity exploration, but as well, people who have multiple cultural identities, right? If you have multiple parts of who you are, there's far more options to explore your identity compared to if you have only one. Then you just don't have as many options for exploration. So this is really relevant for people. If you have multiple cultures as who you are at a time like this, you can end up reacting by being even more committed to your identities than you were before. But there's also a third option. And the third option is that some people end up identifying instead with a more global or what's called a superordinate identity, right? So this would be calling yourself a global citizen, saying we're all in this together. We're all part of one big global community or something along those lines. This would be the third general way that some people react to closed borders and saying, well, the individual borders don't matter as much, but really our collective togetherness is what matters. And I'm going to turn back to Wyle and Farzana, and I'm going to kind of switch the order. So we'll start with Farzana and then go to Wyle this time. Because I know from previous conversations that both of them have used some version of this approach in thinking about themselves. So now I want to ask you each to describe what are some of the maybe unexpected silver linings or any positives that may have come out of it and how you've kind of made sense of that. So Farzana?
I appreciate this conversation and your graphic representation, because for me, I think the silver lining, which connects to this, is that, for example, the negative part of this is that I've had a lot of speaking engagements canceled, especially like my book tour. Here's my book right here, Raising Multiracial Children, Tools for Nurturing Identity in a Racialized World. So I am ending up having to connect with people online rather than in person. And although there was sadness around not being with people locally, what I'm finding in doing these virtual events like this gathering is that we have a lot in common. So there are a lot of things around race, around this movement towards multicultural or multiracial identity that have actually transcended borders. So the narrative around, oh, this only happens in this country or that only happens over there, that is actually being blown apart by our contact with one another. And that wasn't possible before. I think also by being able to connect in this way, we are able to come together in larger numbers and have the information being shared and collective community building as well as healing that's occurring. So I'm seeing a lot of exploration of identity that hasn't happened before. And for me personally, what has happened for me, if I could tell a story, is that with my Filipino side of the family, there are healers and energy workers that have been in my ancestry that I haven't been able to learn more about. And there's this elder in our community who, because he's a tribal tattoo artist, because his tattooing engagements and travel have gotten canceled, he's actually able to come online and share. And because he was able to do that and I was able to watch this, I learned something about my history and heritage that I didn't know before. And so those elders are now passing on wisdom in a way that it gives you chills to think about, like how important that is to move forward in generations, to share that history and ancestry. So I'm very grateful for this connectedness in this time of pandemic. There is this joy of coming together in a collective, and I feel this sense of unity that I think that I probably wouldn't have if it wasn't for this current environment.
Powerful example. Thanks for sharing, Farzana. How neat.
Yeah.
And by the way, I've included links to both of their companies and to Farzana's book in the chat. So if any of you want to check them out, then they're in the chat there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Wyle?
Before I talk about that, I'm just reflecting on that graph you just showed. Can you go back to the slide? Sorry, the identity plurality. So coming to this country, you know, like the first, at the beginning, you are like, oh, this is exciting, it's beautiful, you know, I am here finally, this is the dream and all of that. And then you spend considerable amount of time figuring out your new identity, right? You have your old identity, you have your new identity, or like you have now two identities, and you're trying to figure out which one now is the most important, how they fit together. I came from a conservative culture with a lot of values that some of them at the beginning, I thought, oh, they are contradicting some of the values here, you know? So I struggled with that. And a few years ago, I met this like wise guy. His family is originally from India. And he told me, stop thinking about identity as like a solid structure, you know? Your identity is like clay, and you can mix it and shape it the way you want. And I did great with that. I loved that concept. I shaped my own identity, and it became like this like mix of like all my experiences and all of that. And then now it's interesting because I see that yellow line very strongly. So that piece of clay now is like dissolving to a few like my original identities separating from each other. So in the morning, I talk to my mom and my sister, and I am in one like mindset, you know? And then I finish the call, I go with my kids outside, and I'm in a different mindset, you know? And I like moving from one identity to another became something very, I can really feel, you know? Like at the end of the day, when the kids go to sleep, I open my WhatsApp and I get the news from all my family everywhere. And every time I get in something, I'm in that mindset, you know? So these yellow lines, I saw them and I'm like, wow, that's exactly what I am feeling now. You know, they weren't there a month ago, and now they are like, I can like definitely feel them. Now the silver lining is, it really brought all these identities to interact with each other again, you know? And you are right, Farzana. I'm looking at what we are having here. I'm looking at what my family is going through in Jordan. I have people in Saudi Arabia. I have people in Yemen. I have people I know in Europe. I have people I know, a brother who is in China. And like it gives me this global perspective of things. You know, I'm becoming, I tell people around me, I'm becoming milder in judgment. So I am less judgmental. You know, I see extremes of things. And I see why people making these extreme decisions. And I became more sympathetic to why they are making these decisions. You know, I saw people who are really struggling because they can't work now. I saw people who are really struggling because of the restrictions. I saw people who are really struggling because of health issues. I have family members who I'm very worried if they get the virus. So all these things, you look at them and it's just fascinating, like what a decision happened in some part of the world now is totally impacting people here in Canada, right? Like the world became like really, really closer versus a few years ago when all these crazy leaders that you know who I'm talking about tried to convince us that no, my country is my country, your country is your country, we don't want to interact with each other, my country is great, your country is not great, and vice versa, and all this fight. And we thought all this globalization is just like dying. And I think now we are at a point where no, we have to work together. You know, like if someone has the virus in Vietnam, I should be worried about that, right?
Right.
And if someone like 2 blocks away is going out and not following like social distancing, I should be worried about that. You understand me? So like people's action are impacting each other in a very interesting way. So I think that's the thing. I hope this brings people together and thinking, you know what, the fact that you are living in Spain or I live in Canada or you live in wherever you are, we are very, very connected, you know, and these are some of the lessons I think the world learned after the Spanish flu 100 years ago about social health for everyone, you know, healthcare for everyone. And the fact that I'm rich and someone is poor and they are struggling, I don't care about them, that doesn't make sense anymore. We have to like help each other, you know, and interesting stuff happening in the world now. So it would be interesting to see where we will go like a year or 2 or 3 from now.
Farzana, it looked like you had something else you wanted to add to that.
Well, yeah, I think that I love the point you made, Wyle, around how, you know, we realize that these ideas are opinions. And I think that in order for us to find unity, we have to understand that there are common values underneath those opinions. For example, safety, or care for our family, or fear, right? And so when I see major debates or I see people really polarized, I can't help but come back to this unity in identity around understanding that they're different parts, and that makes a greater whole. And so it is taking a virus for us to see that. I think what I wanted to add is that a struggle I see in North America is that we have been an individualistic society for a very long time. And this is just in seeing how leadership is treasured and valued in organizations, how we make decisions, and the fact that now we have to do things collectively is a muscle that we need to flex. We are stretching in ways we haven't before. We have to think about others that we normally wouldn't. You know, when the news came out about this virus, where the media was saying, oh, it's just older people, or it's just, you know, immunocompromised people, as if they're other rather than as if they're us.
Yes.
So that has shifted now because we're seeing how widespread this is. Unfortunately, it took that. And at the same time, it doesn't see borders. It's traveling everywhere. Absolutely. And at the same time, if I may add, there is systemic inequity around how people are being treated and who's actually surviving and what race is being served in the medical field. Just in terms of bias and stuff, it's never intentional. But so I think that the hard awareness raising and blessing in this is that we are seeing these things surface, and we have to grapple with them as a society together. That's the key, is understanding fundamentally that these things are going on, and then the next step is, what do we do about it?
Absolutely.
Excellent point. So I'm going to follow on that point, Farzana, because I think you really picked up on this. This is simultaneously a time when we feel very globally connected because we're all pulling through this pandemic together, but it could devolve very quickly. And so how do we capitalize on this feeling, and how do we actually work collectively? And so part of that is working through our own senses of self. And the kind of moving on from what I was sharing before about the yellow lines, like Wyle, you were talking about, and great story, by the way, about how that's shifting for you over time and how they change in intensity. But it turns out that there's quite a lot of research about the trying to use a superordinate identity, which is this sense of a global identity. I'm a global citizen. We're all in this together. And there's a lot of research that says this is a wonderful approach. It's good because it tends to be very easy, right? It doesn't tend to fill people with angst or worry. It also, there's a lot of research that shows that it reduces bias against others. This is, Farzana, what you were talking about in the anti-Asian bias, and really the sense of othering, of like, my group is okay, but you know, you guys have a problem, right? That's something that we need to try and avoid if we can all work collectively. The good news is that people who have multiple cultures are actually really well placed to think about themselves with this sort of superordinate or global identity. An example of this is some research that I did a couple of years back with about 800 healthcare employees. And we found that the more that they had more cultural identities within themselves, so they saw themselves as being belonging to multiple cultures, they were more likely to have friends from outside of any one of their own cultures. So for example, someone who was Russian, German, American, they might be more likely to have friends from Peru, right, compared to someone who was, say, Canadian alone. And so that's for, I assume a lot of the people on this call, you yourselves probably have more than one culture, and you can think about yourselves and your network of friends and family in this way. The bad news is that at a time like this, right, if you remember the last slides where I said that at a time of crisis, when borders are closed, people tend to be ever more committed to their own national identities. This is one way that people often respond, right? And for people who are highly committed to their national identities, so this is the identity that's most central to who they are, they tend to be highly resistant to a superordinate or global identity. I'll give you an example from a study here. So this was a study done with university students in the United States. And what you're seeing in the red line is those are people who were highly identified to their kind of smaller group identities. In this case, it wasn't national identities, it was actually the different faculties in the universities. These were science students or humanities students. And in the middle, right, so the control, that's just under normal circumstances. In the middle, you see superordinate identity. And in that situation, the students were asked to think about everyone together. We are all students. We're all together. We're all very similar. We're all students. And for people who are highly identified with being either a science or a humanities student, they didn't like this at all. And they ended up increasing the amount of bias that they had against the others. So the humanities students ended up having more bias. They did not want to work with science students as a result of this superordinate identity, and vice versa. But where it gets better is when you have this, what's called the dual identification. And it's something that both Farzana and Wyle have sort of touched upon, where they say, yes, we care about the global and we say we're all in this together, but at the same time, our own identities and our own cultures and countries where we belong also matter. And that's what they said for the dual identification. That said, where the students were asked to think about themselves, everyone together as students, but also that you can identify strongly with being either a science or a humanities student. And when you think about both of those things together, that's when bias against the other group went way down, even for people who are highly committed to their identities. The explanation here is that when people feel forced to think about only the global and to lose their individual or small group identities, that can feel really, that can create a defensive response of saying, no, that this part of who I am is really important and you can't take that away from me. But when you say you can have that and think about the global, that's when bias against others goes way down. So as a kind of best practice, when we think about how are we actually going to improve the way that we treat others and how are we going to get through this pandemic together, this is one possible way that we can do it, where we think about both the global and we think about our own cultures. Do either Wyle and Farzana, do you have any closing remarks that you want to share at the end of this?
Farzana, you go first.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I appreciate the idea of being able to hold more than one identity at the same time. I think that when we think about loyalty to a cause or a country, or in this case, overcoming this virus, I think people equate that with like heavy patriotism in order to show how committed folks are. But I think what we're discussing here is that you can have that and have empathy for the fact that there are other narratives and there are other experiences other than just this one kind of pan identity. And I think that's the key to empathy, right? That's the key to understanding someone else's point of view and to really making sure that, for example, policies now, as we're shifting and we think about how to improve them, that we look at who's being left behind in this and who is actually being served. So I think that there's a both and here. It's for me, it's never been one or the other. And I think, like I said earlier, we're having to flex. We have to think differently now than we used to. So I appreciate this conversation and hearing Wyle's story and hearing Dr. Fitzsimmons talk about how this looks like in terms of different models, because I think people are living what has been shared.
Yeah, thank you, Farzana. It has been great really being on the panel with you. And thank you, Stacey. I think my message is this is tough. This is very tough. And like I'm smiling now, but I go through times where there is a lot of anxiety and pressure and trying to figure out what the future is, like not being able to control the next month, You know, maybe for some of us 2 weeks, for some of us, they don't know what will happen tomorrow if they have someone in the hospital or themselves are in the hospital. It's very, very like tough time. Now, I would like to think about a little bit of hope, you know, so it's an interesting time. We're learning a lot. We were busy 2 months ago. Every day you wake up, you drop off the kids. I'm talking about myself. If you have kids, drop off the kids, go to work, projects, discussions, conversations, and things slowed down. So it's time to like really think about our identity, what's important for us. Some of us are privileged in many ways. So it's good to think about that, you know, and like how others are struggling and you are privileged in some way or the other, you know. And then I think, I believe in humanity, you know, we will figure this out. We went through like wars and pandemics and like worse things, you know, in the past. And we learned and we evolved and we came together and things improved, you know. So it's an important lesson, a little bit of a tough lesson, you know, but we are learning stuff. And I think I'm hopeful that the future will be bright again, really.
Thank you both. And with that, we're going to close out the kind of more formal part of the webinar here. If you want to stay for Q&A, feel free to stay. If you're done and you want to go on to the rest of your lives, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I'm going to, you know, stand here and say congratulations to Farzana and Wyle. Thank you. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And to the rest of you, stay if you want to for Q&A, and otherwise, have a good rest of your day. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A at the bottom. I see that there is so far a comment rather than a question for Wyle, where Christina Stewart said that perhaps as we age, those identities coalesce again.
Yeah, interesting. You know what, I think about that all the time. You know, age for sure impacts our sense of identity, you know, and you know, like Stacey, like maybe this is interesting research, you know, about the impact of age. For some of us, age brings all these identities together and like gets the best of them, and we learn and we become milder and wiser. For some of us, we get older and we get a little bit more opinionated. And we, you know what, identity is an interesting thing. Like we talk here about like borders and countries, but age in itself is an identity, right? Being a millennial or being a baby boomer. So as like, I for sure now I was just telling the group here that I went biking yesterday, and some age groups are out more than others on the beach playing. And I was a little bit critical. And then I'm like, you know what, it's okay, you know, just like be kind, as Bonnie Henry says, no judgments. So anyway, so age is an interesting thing and how it impacts us. Absolutely, I totally agree with you.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and it varies by people. On average, you were asking about the research on this one, identities tend to be most flexible and most changeable during childhood and adolescence. Mm-hmm. And then after that, change tends to happen more slowly. The only difference is if you've had a major life change, such as immigrating to a new country. And at that point, identity again tends to become more flexible and exploration happens again. And then at some point it will coalesce again, and then change tends to happen more slowly again. Absolutely. Yep. Now, Gods, I see you're on here and you asked a question about the slides. It's so good to see you. He's someone else I really admire who works in the diversity and inclusion space. And for the BC government. He asked about sharing the slides, and I just checked in with Cheryl, and it looks like we should be able to attach the slides. Cheryl, is that right?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, we'll send them out with the link for the video to everyone who is here today.
Okay, super. And in case any of you missed some of the language, I tend to be highly scripted, so you'll find all of my script in the notes sections, and feel free to check that out as well. Let's see. Oh, could you please advise on, so Godzi Ozbilim asked, how can we access the recording of the webinar? I was only able to catch the last few minutes. Oh, Cheryl, you answered. So there's going to be an email out to anyone who registered, so you can access the video that way, for anyone else who is wondering. Any other questions that someone wants to know? Oh, I see here there's a few that are open here. Okay, so God says it's a great webinar, thank you. And Mac, you are asking a question for Wyle. He's asking, reflecting on the internationally caring and supporting, you've mentioned the butterfly effect from chaos theory. Why did you take Vietnam as an example? And Mac is Vietnamese.
Well, hi, Mac. I think the reason is I've been reading a lot about Vietnam. It's a country I would love to go visit. So I care about people in Vietnam. So I think that's just came subconsciously to my brain. No, nothing specific. Cool.
And I see in the chat, Susan Carter has also recommended a book called Elderhood by Louise Aronson about ageism. Thanks for sharing that. Well, if there's no more questions, then I think we're going to close out. Thank you all. Good luck navigating all of this. And sounds like there might be some interest. I've been thinking about designing another webinar in the series that's talking more about, in organizations, how do we actually help people work together across cultures at a time when there may be more, especially anti-Asian racism, and as well some of this othering that crops up over time. We're in this beautiful moment of time when we feel like we're all pulling together, but I do worry in organizations that this may devolve a little bit. So how do we capitalize on this moment and make everyone think about themselves in the collective?
Great.
All right, so stay tuned for that. I haven't designed it yet, but I'm going to work on that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Okay,
everyone.
thank you very much.
Great.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.